ultrasound picture in my pocket felt like it was burning a hole through my coat, a tiny, flickering promise of a future I'd spent years praying for. But as I stood in the shadow of our hallway, breathless from the excitement of a promotion and a positive test, I heard my husband Mark tell his mother that the house would be on the market by Monday, and that I didn't need to know until the closing papers were irrevocable. My mother-in-law's response wasn't a whisper of caution, but a sharp, triumphant laugh that sounded like glass breaking against a stone floor, a sound that instantly turned the warm, familiar air of my home into a suffocating fog. The woman who had held my hand at my father's funeral 3 months ago was now discussing how to liquidate my father's legacy as if it were nothing more than an inconvenient pile of bricks. The house, a sprawling Victorian on the edge of the historic district, was more than just real estate to me. It was the physical manifestation of my father's life's work. He had been a master carpenter, a man who believed that wood had a soul and that a home should be a sanctuary. When he passed away, leaving me the old Willow estate and a significant inheritance, I felt a heavy, sacred responsibility to preserve it. For the last 6 months, Mark and I had lived in a whirlwind of sawdust and paint swatches. I remember the smell of fresh cedar in the mornings, the way the sunlight filtered through the restored stained glass windows in the foyer, casting dancing patterns of ruby and sapphire across the hardwood floors. Mark had been my rock during the mourning period. Or at least, that's the version of the story I told myself. He was the one who brewed the herbal tea when I couldn't stop crying. He was the one who sat with me on the porch swing, promising that we would raise our children here, that the halls would one day echo with the sound of little feet. He looked so sincere back then, his blue eyes soft with what I mistook for empathy. He would tuck a stray lock of hair behind my ear and whisper about our forever, while his hands, the same hands that were now presumably signing away my birthright, traced the outlines of my face with a tenderness that felt like a shield against the world. And then there was Elena, my mother-in-law. Elena was a woman of sharp edges and expensive perfumes, a retired real estate agent who viewed the world as a series of transactions. Initially, she had been helpful. She was the one who brought over pre-made casseroles after the funeral and offered to help organize the mountain of paperwork my father had left behind. "You're grieving, darling," she'd say, her voice like honey poured over a razor blade. "Let me take the burden of the administrative nonsense off your shoulders. Mark and I can handle the boring stuff while you heal." I was vulnerable, drowning in a sea of grief and corporate deadlines, and I let her. I remember sitting at the kitchen island, staring blankly at a pile of legal documents while Elena chirped about property taxes and deed transfers. Mark would sit beside her, nodding, his hand resting reassuringly on my shoulder. It felt like a team effort. It felt like family. I didn't see the way their eyes met when I looked away. I didn't notice how Elena's help slowly evolved into a systematic inventory of everything I owned. Our life seemed so idyllic on the surface. We had our rituals, the Saturday morning trips to the farmer's market, the way Mark would always leave the last bite of dessert for me, the shared dreams of turning the attic into a nursery. I spent $40,000 of my inheritance on the kitchen alone, installing custom cabinetry that matched the original 1920s aesthetic. I remember the day the marble countertops were installed. Mark had popped a bottle of champagne, and we'd toasted to our empire. He looked me in the eye and told me he had never been prouder of the woman I was becoming. I was so blinded by that pride that I ignored the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. I ignored the way Elena started referring to the house as the property instead of your home. I ignored the hushed phone calls that ended abruptly whenever I entered the room. I was too busy being the perfect wife, the grieving daughter, and the rising executive. I thought I was building a fortress of love and security. I didn't realize that the man I slept next to every night was actually a Trojan horse, and the woman I called Mom was the general leading the siege. That morning, the morning everything shattered, had started with such light. I had finally received the news that I was being promoted to senior director, a position that came with a salary bump that would finally allow us to finish the landscaping. And then, the second miracle. the two pink lines on the plastic stick. I had spent the afternoon imagining Mark's face, the way he would cry with joy, the way we would celebrate in our beautiful, restored home. I had even bought a little pair of knitted booties to hide in his dinner napkin, but as I stood there in the hallway, the booties heavy in my pocket, the silence of the house was broken by the muffled conversation coming from the study. The power of attorney is solid, Mark. Elena's voice was crisp, devoid of the maternal warmth she usually performed for my benefit. She signed the broad form version during the week of the funeral. She didn't even read the clause about the right to sell. I told you she was too distracted to notice. I know, but the realtor wants to do an open house while she's at her conference in Chicago next week, Mark replied. His voice sounded different, thinner, colder. We need to make sure the staging company gets in and out before she returns. If she sees the furniture moved, she'll lose it. She'll lose it regardless, Elena scoffed. But by the time she realizes the house is sold and the funds have been moved into our joint offshore account, it'll be too late for her to do anything but cry. And honestly, she should thank us. This place is a money pit. With the commission from this sale and the rest of her father's cash, we can finally move to the coast like we planned. I just hope she doesn't check the bank app, Mark muttered. She won't. You've been managing the household accounts for months. She trusts you, Mark. That's her biggest mistake. Now, call the agent. We have a buyer willing to pay cash, no contingencies. I stood frozen, the walls of my father's house seemingly closing in on me. The very air I breathed felt stolen. The man who had promised to protect me was currently calculating the commission on my soul, and the woman who had fed me soup while I mourned was the one holding the knife. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, and for a moment, the world tilted so violently I had to grab the antique console table to keep from falling. The ultrasound in my pocket was no longer a symbol of hope. It was a testament to the fact that I was now tied to a monster. The signs had been there all along, whispering from the corners of our happy home, but I had been too drowned in the silence of my father's absence to hear them. Looking back now, the memories that once felt like symbols of Mark's devotion felt like a series of meticulously laid traps. I remembered 3 weeks ago when a courier had arrived with a stack of documents. Elena had intercepted him at the door before I could even stand up from the sofa. She'd laughed it off, saying it was just some boring paperwork regarding the estate's final taxes, and that she didn't want to burden my grieving heart with dry legalese. Then there was the night Mark suggested we streamline our finances. He'd sat me down, a glass of my favorite red wine in his hand, and spoke with such earnestness about our future. You're so busy with the promotions, Sarah. Let me handle the contractor payments and the utility bills for the estate. It'll give you one less thing to worry about. I had looked at him, feeling a surge of gratitude for having such a supportive partner. I didn't see the way his fingers drummed nervously against the glass. I didn't question why he needed me to sign a standard authorization form while I was half asleep and drained from a 10-hour workday. I trusted him with my life. Why wouldn't I trust him with a signature? Whenever I did ask about the progress of the probate or the status of the house deed, Mark would brush it off with a kiss. It's all moving along, honey. It's just slow because of the historic designation. Don't worry, I've got Elena's best lawyers on it. If I pressed further, he'd adopt a look of curated pity. You're still so emotional, Sarah. Maybe you should take those vitamins the doctor suggested for the brain fog. You seem so forgetful lately. He was planting seeds of doubt in my own sanity, making me believe that my confusion was a symptom of my grief rather than a result of his deception. The most chilling sign, however, was the way they had pushed for this Chicago trip. For weeks, Elena had been helping me pack, insisting that this conference was the most important milestone of my career. You need to be focused, darling. No distractions. We'll look after everything here. The house will be in good hands. They weren't just encouraging my career. They were clearing the stage for the final act of their heist. As the sound of their voices in the study faded, replaced by the clink of glasses, they were toasting, actually toasting to my ruin. I felt a cold, hard resolve settle in my chest. I didn't burst in. I didn't scream. My body felt like it was made of lead, but my mind was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. I waited, hidden in the shadows of the linen closet, until I heard the heavy front door click shut and the engine of Elena's Mercedes purr to life. Mark was seeing her out. This was my only window. I slipped into the study, the room still smelling of Mark's expensive bourbon and Elena's cloying lily-of-the-valley perfume. My heart was thumping so hard I could hear it in my teeth. I went straight to the mahogany desk, the desk my father had handcrafted for me as a graduation gift. It was a sacred object to me, and seeing Mark's laptop and scattered papers on it felt like a desecration. I tried the bottom drawer. Locked. My breath hitched. Mark never locked anything unless he was hiding something. I remembered he kept a spare key inside a hollowed-out book on the shelf, a cliché he'd thought was clever. My hands were shaking so violently, I almost dropped the key as I fumbled with the lock. The drawer slid open with a soft, mocking hiss. Inside was a thick manila folder labeled Project Horizon. My eyes scanned the first page, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. It was a sales agreement for Old Willow. The sale price was nearly 30% below market value, a quick cash deal to a developer named Sterling Heights Holdings. But it was the second document that truly broke me. It was a broad-form, durable power of attorney. My signature was at the bottom, dated the very day of my father's funeral. I remembered that day. I had been a ghost, a shell of a person, barely able to stand. Mark had handed me a pension waiver for my father's old firm, and I had signed it without looking, leaning on his shoulder for support. He hadn't been supporting me. He had been harvesting my signature while I was too broken to see the pen. I flipped to the last page of the folder. There was a printed email from Elena to the realtor. The owner is mentally unstable and looking to liquidate quickly to cover debts. She will be out of town starting the 14th. We need the sold to sign up by the 16th. My son will handle the transfer of funds to the account we discussed. A wave of literal nausea hit me. I had to lean over the wastebasket, gasping for air, as the room spun in dizzying circles. My stomach cramped. The baby. I placed a hand over my belly, a sob threatening to burst from my throat, but I choked it back. I couldn't afford to break down. Not yet. The physical reaction was overwhelming. My skin felt clammy, my vision blurred at the edges, and my legs felt like they were dissolving into water. I looked at the ultrasound picture I had left on the desk in my haste. It sat there, a black and white image of a life that was supposed to be the start of our family, resting right next to the documents that proved our family was a lie. I heard the front door open. Mark was back. "Sarah? Honey, are you home already?" His voice called out from the foyer, sounding so incredibly, sickeningly normal. I stood there in the middle of the stolen study, clutching the evidence of his betrayal to my chest. The brain fog he had tried to convince me of was gone, replaced by a crystalline, freezing rage. The woman who had entered this house 20 minutes ago, bubbling with joy and news of a new life, was dead. In her place stood a woman who had nothing left to lose but the roof over her head and the legacy of her father. I looked down at the documents one last time, my eyes hardening. The game was no longer about survival. It was about war. I tucked the folder into my laptop bag and stepped out of the study, my face a mask of practiced calm, just as Mark turned the corner of the hallway. "There you are," he said, a bright, false smile on his face. "You're early. How was your day, sweetheart?" He moved to hug me, and it took every ounce of my willpower not to recoil as if he were a serpent. I let his arms wrap around me, feeling the coldness of his wedding ring against my back, the ring I had paid for. "It was enlightening, Mark," I whispered into his shoulder, my eyes fixed on the wall behind him. Truly enlightening. Dinner that evening was a grotesque performance. I sat across from Mark, watching him cut into a steak as if he hadn't just discussed selling the floor beneath my feet. Every scrape of his knife against the porcelain sounded like a scream in my ears. I hadn't told him about the promotion, and I certainly hadn't told him about the baby. The tiny booties were still crushed in my pocket, a painful reminder of the life I thought we were starting. "You're quiet tonight," Mark said, wiping his mouth with a napkin I had hand-embroidered for our first anniversary. "Is everything okay at work? Did the meeting with the board go poorly?" I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the predator behind the soft blue eyes. "The meeting was fine, Mark. In fact, it was very illuminating. I learned a lot about transitions, about how quickly things can move when you're not looking." He paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. A flicker of something, guilt, or perhaps just the instinct of a cornered animal, crossed his face. "Transitions? What does that mean?" "It means I know, Mark." I reached into my bag, which was resting on the chair beside me, and pulled out the Project Horizon folder. I didn't slide it toward him. I dropped it onto the table, right into the middle of his plate. The manila cover soaked up the steak sauce, a dark, ugly stain spreading across the word project. Mark froze. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the clock my father had painstakingly restored, seemed to grow louder, filling the silence between us. When he finally looked up, his face was pale, but he didn't apologize. He didn't beg. "Sarah, listen," he began, his voice dropping into that soothing, patronizing tone he used when he was trying to manage my emotions. "You weren't yourself. After your dad died, you were spiraling. You weren't making sense. This house, it's too much for you. It's a burden. Elena and I, we just wanted to unburden you." "Unburden me?" I whispered, my voice trembling with a rage so cold it felt like ice in my veins. "By forging my intent? By stealing my father's life's work? You were going to sell this house while I was at a conference, Mark. You were going to let me come home to a sold sign and an empty bank account. Did you even think about where I would go?" He looked down at the folder, refusing to meet my eyes. He didn't say a word. This was the man I had shared my bed with for 5 years. This was the man I was carrying a child for, and he couldn't even find the courage to look at me. The silence was deafening, a physical weight in the room. The front door opened with a sharp, familiar click. Elena walked in without knocking, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood. She was dressed for a gala, a fur stole draped over her shoulders. She stopped in the doorway of the dining room, her eyes darting from me to the folder on the table. She didn't miss a beat. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy as she pulled out a chair and sat down as if she had been invited. "I suppose the cat is out of the bag. Honestly, Sarah, your dramatics are exhausting. Mark was doing you a favor. You've been moping around this museum of a house for months, letting your career slide, letting your marriage rot. We decided to take the initiative." "The initiative?" I stood up, my chair screeching against the floor. "You stole my signature, Elena. You manipulated a grieving woman into signing away her inheritance. That's not initiative. That's a felony." Elena laughed, a sharp, dry sound. "A felony? Oh, darling, don't be so naive. You signed those papers in front of a notary. A friend of mine, admittedly, but a notary nonetheless. As for the money, you should know that Mark has already moved the initial deposit. It's gone, Sarah. We used it to pay off the debts he's been racking up for years, trying to keep up with your executive lifestyle." The room spun. "What debts? Mark, what is she talking about?" Mark finally spoke, but he didn't look at me. He looked at his mother. "I had some bad investments, Sarah. The tech startup, it folded. I owed people, a lot of people. I didn't want to tell you and stress you out even more." "He didn't just owe people, Sarah," Elena added, her eyes gleaming with a cruel triumph. "He's been using your father's estate as collateral for months. That kitchen renovation you're so proud of, paid for on credit that he couldn't cover. If we don't sell this house by Friday, the bank is going to seize everything anyway. At least this way, we walk away with something." This was the first twist. The betrayal wasn't just about the future. It was a rot that had been eating away at our past for a long time. But Elena wasn't finished. "And don't bother looking for the rest of your father's liquid assets," she continued, buffing a fingernail on her stole. They were in a joint account, and since you gave Mark full power of attorney, he was perfectly within his rights to transfer them to our family trust. It's for your own good, really. You're clearly not in a state to manage such sums. You took everything? I felt the blood drain from my face. The inheritance, the savings, everything? We secured it, Elena corrected. And frankly, your father owed me that much. He spent 30 years looking down his nose at my family because we weren't artisans like him. He treated my son like a second-class citizen. This is just a late payment for the disrespect. I looked at Mark, waiting for some spark of rebellion, some shred of the man I loved. He just sat there, staring at the steak sauce on the folder, his shoulders hunched. He was a shell, a coward. Is that it, Mark? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. You're just going to let her say these things? You're going to let her steal from the woman you claim to love? It's for us, Sarah, he muttered, still not looking up. We can start over, somewhere else, somewhere cheaper. We can be happy again. Happy? I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, a jagged, broken thing. You think I could ever be happy with a thief? With a man who lets his mother lead him around by the nose while he robs his wife? I reached into my pocket and pulled out the tiny, white knitted booties. I threw them onto the table. They landed softly next to the blood-stained folder. Mark's eyes finally snapped to mine. He looked at the booties, then back at me, his mouth falling open. Sarah, are you? I said, the word was cutting through the air like a blade. I was going to tell you tonight. I thought this was the best day of our lives. I thought we were a family. But you and your mother aren't family. You're parasites. Elena's face hardened, the mask of sympathy finally slipping to reveal the predator beneath. A baby? Well, that changes things. It makes the sale even more urgent. Children are expensive, Sarah. You'll need the cash more than you'll need this drafty old house. You aren't getting a cent of the cash, Elena, I said, my voice suddenly calm, suddenly lethal. And you aren't getting this house. You think you're so smart because you had me sign some papers while I was crying? You forgot one thing about my father. And what's that? Elena sneered. He didn't just teach me how to appreciate wood, I said, leaning over the table until I was inches from her face. He taught me how to read a blueprint, and I've already seen yours. You've made a fatal mistake, both of you. You assumed I was alone. I picked up my phone and pressed a button. You can come in now, I said into the line. The back door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped into the kitchen, followed by my father's oldest friend, Arthur, who happened to be one of the top estate litigators in the state. Mark, Elena, I said, watching the color drain from Elena's face as she recognized Arthur. I'd like you to meet my legal team. And by the way, Mark, I revoked that power of attorney 2 hours ago at the county clerk's office. I had a feeling you might try something, and I always did have a better head for business than you gave me credit for. The silence that followed my announcement was heavier than any grief I had ever carried. It was the silence of a structure collapsing, the beams of their deceit snapping under the weight of their own arrogance. Elena's hand, which had been so steady as she mocked me, began to tremble, the diamonds on her fingers catching the light in jagged, frantic flashes. Mark looked like he had been struck. He stared at Arthur, then at the man in the dark suit, a forensic accountant I had hired weeks ago when the first strange feeling had taken root in my gut. You see, I wasn't as oblivious as they needed me to be. I am my father's daughter, and he taught me that a house is only as strong as its foundation. When Mark started suggesting vitamins for my brain fog, I didn't take them. I hid them in the soil of the potted ferns and watched the plants wither within days. When Elena began helping with the paperwork, I started making digital copies of every document before she could touch them. I had been playing the role of the fragile, broken widow because it was the only way to see how far they were willing to go. Sarah, let's be reasonable, Mark stammered, finally standing up. He reached for my hand, but I stepped back, my movement as cold and precise as a winter frost. We're a family, especially now with the baby. We can settle this quietly. Arthur? Surely there's no need for— There is every need, Mark, Arthur interrupted, his voice a low, rumbling bass that filled the room with authority. We've already been in contact with the district attorney's office regarding the notary, a Ms. Sylvia Vance. She's already admitted, under the threat of losing her license, that the power of attorney was signed under duress and backdated. That makes every transfer of funds and every contract signed under that authority a criminal act of fraud. Elena stood up, her face a mask of twisted fury. You think you're so clever? You're still broke, Sarah. The money is moved. It's in a trust you can't touch. The forensic accountant spoke for the first time, his voice dry and clinical. Actually, Mrs. Thorne, the Thorne Family Trust was flagged for suspicious activity the moment the transfer exceeded $50,000. Sarah had already placed a temporary freeze on all her father's primary accounts 3 days ago. The funds you think you moved? They never left the clearinghouse. They've been redirected back to a private account in Sarah's name only. The look on Elena's face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The triumph drained out of her, replaced by a hollow, gray terror. She looked at her son, looking for a way out, but Mark had finally collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He was a small man, I realized. A tiny, insignificant man who had tried to build a throne out of stolen wood. Get out, I said. My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had the weight of the entire house behind it. Sarah, please, Mark sobbed, his voice muffled by his palms. I did it for us. I was in over my head. I didn't want to lose you because of the money. You didn't lose me because of the money, Mark, I said, walking over to the window and looking out at the willow tree that gave this estate its name. You lost me the moment you looked at my grief and saw an opportunity. You lost me when you chose your mother's greed over your wife's soul. You didn't just steal my inheritance. You tried to steal my mind. That is something I will never, ever forgive. You can't kick us out tonight, Elena hissed, though the venom lacked its former sting. It's raining. I have rights as a guest. You have the right to remain silent, Arthur said, nodding toward the front door as 2 uniformed officers stepped into the foyer. Ms. Vance wasn't the only one who talked. The realtor for Project Horizon was quite talkative once he realized he was being used as a front for an illegal shell company owned by your brother, Elena. Conspiracy to commit fraud is a very serious charge. I watched as they were led out. Mark was silent, his head hanging low, the knitted booties still sitting on the table like a silent accusation. Elena was screaming, her voice fading into the night air as the police cars pulled away, their blue and red lights reflecting in the puddles of the driveway. For the first time in months, the air in the house felt clean. The suffocating fog had lifted, leaving behind a sharp, bracing clarity. The following months were a blur of legal battles and restoration. I filed for divorce the next morning. It took time, but the Project Horizon contracts were voided, the fraudulent debts were wiped clean by the courts, and every cent of my father's legacy was returned to the estate. Elena and Mark are currently serving suspended sentences and heavy fines, their reputations in the community utterly incinerated. Mark tried to call me once, from his mother's cramped apartment, but I didn't pick up. I didn't need to hear his excuses. I had already deleted the man he pretended to be from my life. Today, the old Willow estate is full of light. The nursery is finished, the walls painted a soft, calming sage green. The custom cabinets in the kitchen, the ones Mark tried to use as an excuse for his theft, are now filled with tiny jars of organic baby food and hand-painted ceramic mugs. I spend my evenings on the porch swing, the same one where Mark once whispered lies to me. But now, the only sounds I hear are the wind in the willow branches and the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the child growing inside me. The house feels different now. It's no longer a museum of my father's life or a battlefield for my husband's greed. It is a fortress. I am no longer the girl who signed papers in the dark. I am the woman who built her own light. My father once told me that the best wood is tempered by the storm, and as I rub my belly and watch the sun set over the garden, I know he was right. I was broken, yes, but I was rebuilt with a stronger grain. The betrayal didn't destroy me, it simply stripped away everything that wasn't real, leaving behind a foundation that no one will ever be able to shake again. In the end, they thought they were selling a house, but they were actually giving me the keys to my own strength. And as I walk back inside and lock the door, I realize that the most valuable thing my father ever left me wasn't the gold or the timber. It was the knowledge that a home is only worth as much as the truth lived within its walls.